Hey there, Dr. Croston, it's Samantha Bragg again. You'll have to excuse me, my throat is a little scratchy tonight. So I'm going to go over my paper for our PS633 class. I chose to do the India and Pakistan conflict and why a policy really needs to change regarding it. So the first section of my paper really just gives a brief background of the conflict and why it poses a threat. So the conflict emerged due to the partitioning of India and Pakistan, which led to the bitter and violent battles between the Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs. So the territory of Kashmir became really the centerfold of conflict due to the fact that Muslims primarily inhabited it. However, the partition boundary gave the territory to India. So wars soon broke out between the two nations as to who was the rightful ruler of the land. The fighting continued on for decades to follow, and still, not so much fighting today, but there is, the conflict between the two. However, in 1998, both nations declared their nuclear capabilities. So, although the rest of the world was very aware of the conflict between the two, the fact that there was now nuclear capability involved, it really raised the stakes and caused for more international actors to take a greater interest. So treaties such as, the Non-Proliferation Treaty and Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty were attempted, along with technology controls and sanctions, but none really provided the resolution that the international community had hoped for. India had drafted a nuclear doctrine which highlighted points such as, no first use, and there were some exceptions, a secured second strike capability, a triad of delivery systems, and a defined chain of command. And while they, drafted this doctrine, Pakistan really did nothing of the sort. They kind of just left it as a free-for-all. It has to be noted that while India possessed, the strategic depth, Pakistan really doesn't. And didn't. And it can potentially cause for India's conventional ground or air forces to come in contact with Pakistan's strategic nuclear forces. So if this should happen, it could cause Pakistan to use its nuclear capability due to the fact that if this capability is undermined, it really won't have any military strategy left. So although India may realize that conventional warfare is still capable, Pakistan is being somewhat less advanced in its military strategy, may employ its nuclear weapons to maintain the upper hand over India. So that's a huge threat. I mean, India may not see it as nuclear warfare, whereas Pakistan just wants to have the upper hand and will employ that nuclear capability. So the next section of my paper goes over U.S. policy on the conflict. What makes it so interesting, the India-Pakistan conflict, is that the U.S. is really dealing with friends rather than adversaries. So the goal is to pretty much prevent or limit conflict rather than eliminating a potential military threat. This conflict came to rise at a time when the U.S. was really absorbed in the Vietnam conflict and still trying to resolve other Cold War concerns. It was really clear at that time that the U.S. was willing to let India and Pakistan kind of fight it out and figure it out for themselves, because there was really little support from the U.S. at the beginning of their conflict. The minimal support that was given to both India and Pakistan in regards to the conflict came from UN-backed initiatives. So in 1965, even though the U.S. really wasn't doing much at the time, in 1965 it placed an Arms Embargo Act on the nations, and this really placed a great deal of hardship on Pakistan due to the fact that it acquired all of its weaponry and ammunition from the U.S. And also, after the emergence of nuclear capability in each nation, the U.S. Didn't really use specific policies towards the nation to resolve the conflict, but used and still really uses its working relationship with both of the nations in hopes to prevent conflict, current or future. So in doing this, the U.S. really has to maintain a neutral position So to not seem like it's favoring one nation over the other, if it did, it could cause even more problems regarding the conflict. And as we've seen after the events of 9/11 and with the war on terror, the South Asian region really called for greater ties to both India and Pakistan for the U.S. Pakistan definitely became a geographically strategic necessity for the U.S., as it's known for harboring terrorist cells, and it's literally right next to Afghanistan. Some scholars will even go so far as to argue that the relations between both India and Pakistan directly correlate with the stability of Afghanistan and the possibility of it becoming a functioning state. What I feel is so interesting about the necessary U.S. relationships with both India and Pakistan in regard to the war on terror is that Pakistan tends to rely more on the U.S. and think that it will be able to receive aid from the superpower should anything happen because of its geographic location and its strategic necessity for the U.S. However, the U.S. has really begun to criticize Pakistan for not diligently working to eradicate terrorists, the terrorist safe havens, while India continues to emerge as a great supporter of the efforts in the region. So this has really caused U.S. policy to shift from using Pakistan as a strategic support in the region to giving most of its support to India instead. And although it can be argued that U.S. policy sometimes lacks in regards to the ongoing conflict, India and Pakistan's policy towards each other really, they surely do not lack. What's funny about, well, I guess it's not really funny, but what's interesting is that while each nation has their own strategic objectives when it comes to the conflict over the Kashmir territory, I would say ironically, but it's probably not very ironic, each of their objectives counter the others. So whatever India is doing, Pakistan's countering that, and whatever Pakistan's doing, India's going to counter that. So the next section of my paper goes over how, the India-Pakistan conflict involves other nations. So as I mentioned previously, it was expected that the U.S. or the UN would come to the rescue of either India or Pakistan or both, especially given that global community feeling that the world was experiencing after the Cold War. But the U.S. really didn't rush in to be any savior of any nation. The UN attempted to draft a ceasefire agreement in 1965, but India and Pakistan didn't stick to the treaty and were back fighting one another within a 6-year span. Most of the nations in the international community attempted to dissuade the nations from conflict. However, China took the opportunity to aid Pakistan in its efforts against India due to its historical India-China hostility. What I found really interesting and had no idea what was going on is that China has made heavy strategic economic investments in Pakistan to ensure that India remains the common enemy. However, diplomatically, China will issue messages stating things such as they hope Pakistan will not initiate any type of assault on India, but if war does break out, they would back Pakistan. What's also interesting to me is that China is definitely a rising superpower, if not going to take the #1 spot here shortly. And so is India. So this kind of hostility between the two is just somewhat surprising to me. And China is definitely a larger nation, which the conflict draws interest to. But as it was mentioned earlier, this conflict creates an instability within the region that allows for places like Afghanistan to remain unstable. So should the conflict resolve between India and Pakistan, it could allow for a greater alliance within the South Asian region that could potentially prevent further conflict from occurring. So the next section goes over current suggestions on how to resolve the conflict, and these are mostly scholarly suggestions that I was able to research. So like I just stated, many scholars will argue that by stabilizing South Asia, it completes a long-term interest of the U.S. because it would facilitate the maintenance of the balance of power within the region. So some scholars go on to argue that if the U.S. can convince Pakistan to resolve the Kashmir conflict, because it is in Pakistan's long-term interest, the U.S. could potentially offer a peaceful nuclear cooperation by providing Islamabad a missile defense system and other conventional military hardware. But should the U.S. start concerning itself with the long-term stability of the region, it really needs to consider the democratization of Pakistan, which means that the U.S. would have to pull away from its dependence on Pakistan's defense forces and really focus on the democratization of the nation instead. So clearly the biggest issue for most regarding the India-Pakistan conflict is the fact that both nations have acquired nuclear capability. Not only is the threat of nuclear war between the two concerning, but the fact that nuclear technology could possibly proliferate across borders into the regions like Afghanistan, Iran, or even to non-state actors like the terrorists that are being harbored in Pakistan. In terms of negotiating peace between India and Pakistan, it's argued that the U.S. should pursue bilateral, regional, and international venues for its good offices and political pressure, but should never leave the nations in doubt of support for ultimate peace. I also found it interesting that they're saying, or scholars are saying, that these peace efforts and stability of the two nations should not be limited to just India and Pakistan, but should seek out across Asia in order to unite efforts and create, somewhat of a coalition within the region. So the last part of my paper goes over the policy that needs to happen. So while the policy regarding India and Pakistan are really nation-specific and not conflict-specific, the two nations do play a role in the other's U.S. policy. So as mentioned previously, the U.S. must be careful when it comes to policy regarding either India or Pakistan, so to not make one feel like it's favored more than the other. The U.S. must continue to maintain negotiations, balance bilateral support and engagement with both India and Pakistan so it can secure its interests in the region. And given the necessity of the cooperation of Pakistan in the war on terror, the U.S. has really tended to overlook some of the underlying issues and wrongdoing of the nation. So I really argue that while the relationship between the two is important, the U.S. can't overlook issues of violations just to secure its interests, because then it's kind of going against all that it's promoting in that region. And with the war on terror dying down in the region, the U.S. should begin working on peacekeeping attempts between India and Pakistan. And granted, the fighting has really kind of died down a little bit between the two nations. There still exists, the conflict over the territory between the two. So that's something that the U.S. could probably look into doing once, everything in Afghanistan is over. But with the way that Iraq is going, I'm not so sure that peacekeeping attempts between the two will take place anytime soon. So the last point I really make is that should the relation between India and Pakistan become a working one, it could also allow for economic growth within Pakistan. And although policy should begin to work to help resolve the ongoing conflict between the two, it must also keep the bilateral approach in mind. So separately, both nations still prove to be necessary allies. However, the two working together could only allow for a better strategic upper hand in the South Asia region for the United States. So that's it for my final paper for PS633. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next semester. Thanks.